Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the Treasury of Common Sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
How are you, Leith?
Yeah, good, thanks, Phil. How about yourself?
I'm okay. I've noticed that the New South Wales and Queensland governments have released their state budgets. Any good?
The areas which are most interesting from the state budgets actually relate to housing policy. So both New South Wales and Queensland announced some, pretty significant housing policy announcements. And to me, it basically highlighted how both states are fighting a losing war on housing. So we'll look at New South Wales first. So the most significant initiative in New South Wales budget on Tuesday was the government's pledge to guarantee up to $1 billion of new housing developments. So effectively, we have this situation, not just in New South Wales, but around Australia, whereby property developers often face troubles getting finance for new projects because they lack adequate pre-sales. So often if a developer goes to a bank and they want to get, a large sum of money for a development, they'll say, okay, how many pre-sales do you have? And they'll have to say, well, we don't have enough or whatever, and they'll get rejected finance. So that means that the development doesn't go ahead, and we obviously don't get that supply. So what the New South Wales government has promised to do is to purchase any unsold stock in a housing development up to $50 million per development. So effectively, they want to become the buyer of last resort. So that means that it should appease banks' concerns about the financial viability of projects, and it should encourage qualified developers to borrow more to build projects, which should therefore increase supply. So the New South Wales Treasurer, Daniel Mookhey, claimed that the policy would, quote, bring forward the construction of up to 15,000 extra homes over the next 5 years. Now, that's obviously a good thing. 15,000 extra homes is great, but it's nowhere near enough. So the federal government's Advisory Council on Housing, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, released a report last month, and a forecast suggested that New South Wales would only meet 65% of its agreed housing target over the next 5 years. So what it basically said is that New South Wales would deliver 130,000 less homes than is required to meet its housing target. So in this regard, the New South Wales government's buyer of last resort policy, which, as Daniel Mookhey said, aims to deliver 15,000 homes over 5 years, that's great. But the federal government's own Advisory Council on Supply says that New South Wales is facing 130,000 supply gap. So obviously 15,000 is a lot less than 130,000. In fact, it's only 12% of 130,000. So, this basically shows you that New South Wales' housing market, even if this policy did deliver what's promised, is still going to be massively undersupplied of housing. Right. Which just means the housing crisis is going to drag on. And there's also the risk that New South Wales taxpayers could be left carrying the can for poorer quality development. So presumably, if a development can't sell and the taxpayer has to step in and buy these apartments, you'd think that it's more likely to be in developments that are poor quality. So, for example, if a developer goes out and builds a whole bunch of not very good townhomes or apartments or whatever, and they struggle to sell them because they're not very good and people don't want to buy them, the taxpayer could be left picking up these apartments.
Yeah, of course.
So there is obviously a risk of that. That's pretty much an outside risk. But when we dig down to it, so this National Housing Supply and Affordability Council forecast 130,000 deficit of homes, so not 130,000 fewer homes to be supplied than are required. This policy says we'll do another 15,000, so that's obviously a lot less. The key problem here, Phil, is that the fundamental reason why New South Wales has a housing shortage is because of excessive net overseas migration. So the population data came out last week from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and what it showed is that New South Wales grew by 108,000 people last calendar year, so 2024, and that was driven almost 100% by net overseas migration of 107,000. So New South Wales lost about 28,000 people to other states, which offset the net births. That's births minus deaths. So effectively, all of New South Wales' population growth last year came from people coming from overseas. And in fact, in the decade to December 2024, so for the last 10 years, New South Wales' population has grown by 983,000. And net overseas migration, so people arriving from overseas, has accounted for 88% of that.
Wow.
That's 882,000. And also, the remainder of that is natural increase, which is birth, minus deaths, but migrants also have children. So if you bring a whole 882,000 migrants into New South Wales, well, some of those migrants are going to have children, and then that gets counted as natural increase. So what this tells you is that all of New South Wales' population growth, and therefore housing demand, which is causing this housing crisis, is because of this very high level of net overseas migration. So if the New South Wales government really wants to solve this problem, this policy is great, but what it really needs to do is to tell the federal government to slow immigration down.
Yeah.
And cut it to, a sensible and sustainable level that is compatible with New South Wales and, it goes for the other states as well, Australia's capacity to build housing and infrastructure, because really for the last 20 years, the federal government has fire-hosed huge amounts of net overseas migration into the country. The state that gets the lion's share of that net overseas migration is New South Wales, followed by Victoria and Queensland. So therefore, if we've got this, pervasive chronic housing supply problem, the logical solution is to slow that net overseas migration down, and then you will actually solve the housing shortage. And that is really the number one solution here. Everything else is window dressing. And that's really what Daniel Mookie and Chris Spins should be doing. They should be saying to Canberra, look, we can't build enough houses quick enough to keep up with this supply, this massive demand that you keep bringing into our state through net overseas migration. So you need to slow this down. And I think that is the real solution. Now, just turning to Queensland. So Queensland has taken a different road to their housing policy, but it's also equally important. I think it's actually a lot worse. So just to put some numbers around this, Brisbane's median home price has surged by 85% since March 2020, right? So the cost of housing in Brisbane has absolutely rocketed since the pandemic. And according to PropTrack, which is a housing analysis firm, they estimate that Brisbane's median home value was $889,000 in May, and that's actually the second highest in the nation now, behind Sydney. So Brisbane used to be, relatively affordable. It was a lot less than Melbourne, etc. Now Brisbane is the second most expensive housing market in the country. And the Queensland state budget this week announced the most generous shared equity scheme in the nation. So what it basically said is it wants to promise, to help Queensland first home buyers, I should just say Queensland home buyers, purchase homes valued at up to $1 million. So under its policy, single households earning up to $150,000 and households with two adults earning up to $225,000 will be eligible for basically a shared equity scheme whereby the Queensland state government will invest either 30% of equity in the new builds or 25% into existing houses up to $1 million. And what this effectively means is that it'll allow a whole bunch of people who couldn't previously afford to get into housing in Queensland to now be able to purchase housing. And what it'll do is it'll bring a whole bunch of new buyers in the market. And like first home buyers grants or any other of these sorts of policies that we've seen over the last 25 years, it's ultimately just going to push up home prices, because you're going to have increasing demand, increasing number of buyers, people borrowing more than they would have otherwise, bidding on the same amount of stock. And what it's going to end up doing is just going to end up pushing up home prices. So what it means is that it's actually very self-defeating from a housing affordability perspective. And it's just going to drive prices higher. And what that means is once you drive the prices higher, as we've seen over the last 25 years, you end up just with a less affordable housing market in the end. And it's also worth noting that this policy this shared equity policy in Queensland comes alongside the Reserve Bank of Australia, which has already cut interest rates twice, and it's forecast to cut rates by another 3 times this year, which is going to add more demand to housing and push up house prices. Also, the federal government has announced a 5% deposit scheme for first home buyers, which comes into effect on the 1st of January 2026. So all these sorts of policies, lower interest rates, shared equity schemes from the Queensland government, the federal government's 5% deposit scheme, all it's going to end up doing is just going to add way more demand to the housing market. People are going to borrow more money. We're going to have higher household debt. and it's going to end up just pushing up home prices even further. And it's actually the last thing you want to do when you have a housing affordability problem is actually just increase demand so you make homes structurally more unaffordable. And we've really seen how this story ends throughout this century with first home buyer grants, shared equity schemes. All these sorts of schemes we've seen in the last 25 years have all just ended up pushing prices higher. They haven't made housing more affordable. And in the end, we've just ended up with higher home prices and more household debt. So unfortunately, I think the Queensland government's policy is self-defeating from an affordability perspective. It's just going to make the situation even worse.
Always good to talk to you, my friend. It is the Treasury of Common Sense. Thank you so much. Enjoy your holiday.